Now we will move from the political dimension of the emergence of Jim Crow laws in the South to the social dimension. But first, let me remind you that all three dimensions, the political as well as the social and economic, are all interconnected. And they're pretty much happening simultaneously, say, during the last decades of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And of course, the cumulative effect here is exactly a segregated society mandated by law. And if you know anything about the civil rights movement after World War II, Martin Luther King and so forth, they call that Reconstruction Phase Two. Some historians do. The civil rights movement of the 20th century. The effort there is to dismantle Jim Crow, as you likely know. In any case, let's recap really fast the political dimension because it's so important. What Southern lawmakers are attempting to do is disenfranchise African Americans, take away their right to vote. And they realize they can't violate the law, the 15th Amendment in the Constitution, but is there a way to still circumvent that law? And they said, yes, we can by inventing other reasons to prevent blacks from voting that has no racial, reference at all, right? By outward appearances, these laws don't even mention skin color or race. And of course, these include, um, grandfather clause and poll taxes, property taxes, and so forth. All right, so in other words, these served as proxies for race and skin color. So now we move to the social dimension. And again, let me remind you that in the 1870s and perhaps even the early 1880s, there's an impressive amount of social interaction in public spaces. You see African Americans intermingling with white Southerners in the South in places like, restaurants and, public streets, of course, transportation. But then, of course, we talked about this backlash that happens. We talked about, for example, the rejection of the vision of the New South, so to say, to industrialize, right, like the North. Well, it was felt it's too much uh, like what Northerners do. We're Southerners. We don't like that. They saw it as, part of the Republican Party, which they hated. So, similarly, we see a backlash against that social intermingling in public spaces. And it starts kind of slow. One of the first places, in fact, that's still marked today as important historical site was in Atlanta, the city of Atlanta in Georgia, where you had this park that was segregated. It's, I believe, the first area that was legally segregated, that is. And then from there, you can imagine it spills over to restaurants and transportation to the point where schools and even school repositories for books, right, where you store the books, those were segregated. Areas that you call vice, like racetracks, red light districts, those were segregated. Not to mention, the familiar places like restrooms, restaurants, and so forth. So again, by the turn of the 20th century, this is fully realized social segregation. Even water fountains are segregated. Okay. All right. So now, of course, there's going to be some activists in the South that try to overturn these new laws that are segregating them. They realize that this is a step backwards for African Americans to achieve justice in the South and equality. And therefore, you see numerous activists involved, but perhaps the most well known is Homer Plessy and the Homer Plessy court case. And that's Homer Plessy in this slide. And let me give you a little backdrop on Homer Plessy. He was 1/8 African American. Now, this brings up an important legal indication of how to classify one's racial status back then in some states in the South, and that's called the one drop rule. The one drop rule was this: if it could be determined through civic records that in your ancestry, in your family, going back, that there was one member, at least one member who was African American, that makes you automatically black, or Negro was the term back then. Okay, not white. You may look white. You may have, blonde hair, in fact, and the palest skin, right? It didn't matter. You were still black. All right. And by the way, this shows how race is a social construction, right? This is how they constructed race back then in the South, and actually spilled over beyond the South in some areas, the one drop rule. Okay, so Homer Plessy has uh, 1/8 African American blood, so to speak. And by the way, the use of the word blood is a misnomer because it's uh, um, incorrectly suggests that there's a biological component to race, like the one drop rule, for example. When you think of one drop, you think of blood, right? But we know it's a social construction. But I'm just using it because it's everyday language for now, okay? According to Plessy's worldview. All right, so he had 1/8 blood, so to say, and therefore he's quote Negro. And it's important because he passes for white, right? All his outward appearance, his physical appearance, doesn't suggest he is African American or quote Negro. And this means that he could actually board some transportation vehicles, and he could actually board the white car. Like on the train, there's white cars, then there's colored cars, right? He boards the white cars on purpose. And then he publicly announces that he is indeed Negro, so to say. And then, of course, he's told to get off the car and go to the colored only car. He refused to do so. And this leads to a court case. Now, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Okay, traveled from local Georgia court to the Supreme Court. And here is what the Supreme Court basically said. And basically, they sided with Southern segregation laws, the state laws. One aspect of it was that the federal court, the Supreme Court, could not intervene in the Southern court cases, specifically relating to race. Okay. And moreover, they added something called separate but equal, quote unquote. They're saying so long as conditions are equal, well, there's nothing that the Supreme Court can do, or federal laws in general can do, when state laws mandate legal segregation. Okay? Equal, right? Equal conditions. So, this is the Supreme Court's decision. Let me remind you, it's usually the case that those who are appointed are considered some of the brightest legal minds in our nation. But here they are in 1896, when this was decided upon by the Supreme Court, basically saying that racial segregation is okay, right? So this is certainly a stain on our legal history, needless to say, all right? The Supreme Court issuing such a law. Okay, so this is how social segregation becomes not only spread legally throughout the South, but a way that an obstacle that could potentially dismantle such state laws, namely the Supreme Court, was able to be staved off as a threat, okay, through the Supreme Court itself, Plessy versus Ferguson case. And as you may know, Plessy versus Ferguson would finally be overturned by the Supreme Court in 1955 in the famous court case of Brown versus the Board of Education. It would effectively overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, now moving on from the social dimension to the economic, and here I don't have an actual slide, but this is something we went over already when we discussed Reconstruction, and that's sharecropping. As we noted, African Americans, once they became freed from slavery, most of them, the overwhelming majority, had no choice but to enter these unequal relations with landowners, right, who charged them exorbitant rates to use their land. And not only that, they had to borrow, like, material and supplies and basic necessities from the country store. So that just added more. It compounded their debt to the point where they became immersed in a cycle of perpetual debt. And again, let me remind you that historians refer to this as slavery by another name. Now, to be sure, they're not put in chains, but taking away that aspect, their lives resemble that of slaves before the Civil War. They're working for nothing because they can't pay back the exorbitant interest rates that were there on purpose. And again, let me remind you, this was an ingenious way, when you think about it, to get African Americans back on the land to work for free, right? So the sharecropping system, also known as the crop lien system, LIEN, crop lien system, became the way the South was economically organized if you were poor, right? And by the way, there were some white sharecroppers too, should be noted. Okay, so they're subject to much of the unfair conditions as well. But as we also noted, some states in the South found ways to maintain their right to vote through things like the grandfather clause. Okay, all right, so now you have all three dimensions: the economic dimension that involves sharecropping. You have social segregation, highlighted by the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, whereby the Supreme Court basically did not intercede, did not intervene in the Southern efforts to legally mandate social segregation. And of course, you have the political dimension, where Southern leaders found a way to circumvent the Constitution by introducing proxies that stood for race in actual truth.